Bashwanabe Junjaba. My spirit name is Shooting Star Woman. I'm Bear Clan, and I originally come from Bashwanabe, Ontario, which is on beautiful Lake Superior. But my husband Dan and I have been living in London for the last 35 years, and we're going to celebrate on August 13th our 35th wedding anniversary. So we'll be able to remember that time, especially because this is the 35th gathering of Trent. We used to come here. Dan mentioned in the other room that we used to come here in the 70s, and I would play my guitar and sing Buffalo St. Marie songs. So I really feel good coming back here again. In the 90s, we used to come to attend the elders conferences, but it got so crowded and we had a hard time getting rides, so we weren't able to come for a while. So we're going to do an opening song, and this song is an Iroquois song. And when Dan and I were just dating, we always would get up at a social or a powwow when they sang a song. It was like our dancing song. But this is a round dance song. Dan and I have been doing everything together since we started dating. And in the 70s, when we first started dating in Toronto, there weren't any eagle feathers on being brought out for ceremonies, and there were hardly any ceremonies being done then. And on our first date, we found out that each of us had been in a sweat lodge, and that bonded us together right away. I had been in a sweat lodge on Manitoulin Island when I was 19 years old, and Dan spent his 20th birthday in a sweat lodge in New York with the Iroquois people. So we have been doing our ceremonies together. We have a mixed marriage. A lot of people don't realize that. But Dan being a Seneca from the Iroquois Confederacy and myself being mostly Ojibwe. I found out that I'm 5 parts Ojibwe, 1 part Lakota, 1 part Mi'kmaq, and 1 part French. So we harmonized our traditions together, and so this is what we're sharing with you is our traditions of the smudging ceremony and our working together. 21 years ago, we started in radio in London. It was at the time of when the Oka crisis was happening, and people were stopping us on the street asking us what we thought, because all the reporters on all the news channels were all non-native, and nobody asked a native person what was happening. So that started us a man asked us if we would like to be on his radio show, so he gave us a 10-minute spot on a show called Green Waves, and we went in there once a week, and we reported like on local news or events happening. And after a couple months, the manager of the station asked us if we would like to have a 1-hour radio show. So we did accept that offer after consulting with our elders, and shortly after that, they gave us a 2-hour show. So we started doing radio, and we started traveling a lot to get interviews with elders and with some native politicians and storytellers. So we have tapes dating to June 13th, 1990. We recorded every show that we did. And so in the 90s, I started writing for Anishinaabe News. I went to Fanshawe College till 1990, and I was going to enroll in this program at the University of Western Ontario called the Journalism for Native People. It's close to that title anyway. But they canceled the program the year that I was going to register into it. So I never did go there. And in the 90s, I started writing on my own after a request to write an article for a magazine. And for 7 years, I wrote for the Anishinaabe News and Ojibwe Akin, the News from Indian Country, and it was printed in, I think it was called The Messenger from Ottawa. And Dan started writing hard news stories, and we started getting checks in the mail all the time, so that was really exciting for us, And almost 12 years ago, we were approached by the television station in London. They asked us if we would come on the news and do a commentary. So every other Friday night, we went on the news and we commented about whatever was going on in the Indian world, or whatever was happening in the community, or we would talk about those kind of things. And I remember the first one we did. I don't know, some of you older people might remember this box of cereal called Country Cornflakes, and they had those old people were standing there like this, just real stiff, holding their pitchfork, and their face was just grim. And they weren't moving a muscle, and that's what we looked like when we did our first TV show on the news. And so 6 months later, we went to the Native Journalists Association in Buffalo, and they were offering to critique people's work. So we took a copy of our first show and a copy of the one that we did 6 months after, and there was a tremendous difference. We had become relaxed in front of the camera. And so for the past 8 years, we've been doing what they call an interstitial. An interstitial in anatomy is a space in between the cells, but the space is different shapes, like different lengths, different sizes. So our interstitials, they range from a minute and a half to a minute or just 30 seconds. And so when we have visiting elders coming into the area, we interview them and we share what they have to say with the public in London, and it's all over southwestern Ontario. I think we get about 8 million viewers or so, close to there. So I'll let you talk then.
Okay. As Mary Lou introduced, we started off in radio. So radio is in the oral tradition. It was very conducive for us because we really enjoyed speaking in the oral tradition. We've over the years been able to record and interview many elders. So we have all that footage, that raw footage of. Now it's all archival. I would say it's archival wisdom, oral wisdom of our elders, because we interviewed Jay Thomas, Art and Eva Solomon. Over the years too, that we've had the good fortune of coming into contact with a lot of couples. And at the time that Mary Lou and I were getting together, we encountered a lot of family dysfunction that we inherited from our own families, and that kind of behavior played out in our relationship. And so we had a really negative relationship for a long time until we quit drinking and drugging and that kind of crazy lifestyle. But as we embarked on our radio careers in about 89, 88, 90, we had the good fortune of coming into contact with a lot of couples, a lot of role model man and wife. And they became like our role models, eh? And then we started to, and they could see us in the same way as wanting to absorb how to treat one another. And it's just like in this archetype symbol of the circle, where there's no beginning, no end. When our elders, they reach a stage in their life when they know that it's important to pass on that knowledge and that wisdom to the young person. As young people, I guess we were ready. We were at that right time in our lives. We were ready to absorb that, and we were ready to listen to them, and we were ready to take their advice and advisement to bear to heart, so that we could try it and become better human beings and better in our relationship. So today, I think 35 years, the way I look upon it is what the men taught me: Art Solomon, Adam Lucier, Jake Thomas, Joe Couture, who was here at Trent. What they taught me was that I'm responsible for my own character defects, my own change. For many years, I used to always take Mary Lou's inventory and her character defects, and that was wrong. And the reason that's wrong is because I was never looking at myself. And so as I began to look at myself and where I had to make changes, and I had to become a better human being, a better man, provider, protector, peacekeeper, teacher, ceremonial person for my wife, to take care of her and our family, I started to realize that it's up to me to change myself and accommodate change me so that I could accommodate our relationship. So I'm very grateful to all those men who spent the time with me around the sacred fire in ceremony to pass on to me those good traits of how to be a good man to my partner. So as we began to interview a lot of these elders, we began to absorb their knowledge and their wisdom. Fortunately, we had advice from Joe Couture, who told us that, I remember when I was first starting out wanting to learn about my culture, my identity, I had gone to a university. I found myself down at Princeton University in southern New Jersey, and I was there for 2 years, but I didn't have a strong identity. I was not really sure of who I was, and as a result of that, I couldn't dedicate my interest to getting an education, as well as dedicating my interest to helping my people. And I wanted to do both, but because I wasn't very strong in knowing who I was, I ended up flunking out. So I had to leave school, and I had to take a piece of gainful employment or some productive activity. So I found myself at in the first apprenticeship relationship that I ever had. It was with a Tuscarora elder by the name of Matt Bear Anderson. He came from Tuscarora, Lewiston, New York, and he was an elder who was a faith keeper of the Tuscarora people. And he took my brother under his wing, and then when my brother came, my brother brought myself and my sister. So the three of us kind of traveled around with Mad Bear. And one of the first places that Mad Bear took us to was the Onondaga Nation, the Onondaga Reservation near Syracuse, New York, a place called Metro. And we went to a Grand Council. Now, a Grand Council is, in the old days, it would be a gathering, a circle of 50 chiefs of our people that would represent all the clans and all the nations of the Great Law of Peace Constitution. And so we ended up at this Grand Council in 1974, and it was interesting because we made a decision. I'm watching all this, but I saw them make a decision on supporting the Mohawk people going to reclaim their territory in a place called Ganyange in the Adirondack Mountains, and the Confederacy supported them in going back to get their land, reclaiming their land. And it was interesting because shortly thereafterwards, the news hit that the Mohawk people had gone and reclaimed a Girl Scout camp that was in the Adirondack Mountains, and it became big news. And I got to see from its inception how that all came to be. Also at this time, Dennis Banks, who Tom Jackson was talking about last night, Dennis Banks came to the Grand Council this was after the reclamation of Wounded Knee, the little hamlet of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota that was reclaimed by the American Indian Movement. And Dennis came to the Onondaga Longhouse and he publicly thanked the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee people, for their support, their solidarity work, their movement of supplies into Wounded Knee. And if you recall that story at all, there was a lot of reconnaissance, a lot of surveillance by the United States government, and it was heavily surveyed, and the only way you could get supplies in and out and movement in and out of people was at nighttime, and they used owls to take them into Wounded Knee without being caught, without being detected by the surveillance technology of the United States government. So when I saw Dennis Banks, I was quite, he was a celebrity. I had only heard about him in the news, and often that news was very misrepresentational. Okay, and I remember seeing him for the first time, and then because he was a good friend of Mad Bear Anderson's, I sat down with him. I sat down with him at every opportunity I could. I sat down with Dennis and with Mad Bear because they were like old friends. They were good buddies. They'd known each other for a long time, and they would visit. They would kid each other. One of the interesting traits of our people is our humor. Many of you know this, and one of our brothers, Drew Hayden Taylor, was telling us in one of our interviews with him, we have this trait called permissible disrespect. It's an anthropological term that describes how we kid each other. And the way we kid each other is to show them that we like them. So if you go into a community and they don't kid you, then you should be worried. So over the years, Mary Lou and I, when we've gone to go into a community to get a story, we try to kid them, and they kid us. When they kid us back, then we know that they're accepting us, and that we can start to get our story, to start asking the questions that need to be asked to get the story. And oftentimes, when you go to do that, because we are storytellers, I like to quote it this time. I like to quote, what's that, Tobias?
Oh, Tobias?
Yeah. David, you know David McLaren's wife?
Oh,
No, her name is, anyway, she's a writer.
Lenore Kishik.
Yeah, Lenore Kishik Tobias from the Chippewas of Nawash. Well, Lenore Kishik described it like this. There's 4 types of storytelling. The first type is the type that where you hear the traditional teachings, the traditional stories of Nanabush, the traditional teachings of the trickster that are like morality stories, teaching us right from wrong. And they're told with a lesson. And they're shared in a way that comes from the old way of storytelling. And we have people who are keepers of those stories. And their job is to recite those stories at certain times of the year. Like this winter time is one of those good times to share the stories, or at certain ceremonies. And that type of storytelling is still alive and well. We still have a lot of those storytellers walking around, sharing their stories, and they take on apprenticeships where they teach young people how to do that. But you have to have a good mind for detail and a good mind for timing to tell those stories in a good way. You know a good storyteller when you hear it, when you're just mesmerized by their words, and they just capture your whole attention, everything about you. Usually you capture it in your heart because they're telling it from their heart, and you record it in your heart. So for that kind of storytelling, we've over the years, Mary Lou and I have recorded that with the permission of the storyteller. Oftentimes we turn our recorders off because it's so beautiful just to hear them share their stories. So that tradition of storytelling format is still alive and well. The second kind of storytelling is the oral historians, the people who can quote and read wampum bells, read all the symbology on wampum bells, read all the stories, the narratives that go on that come from our oral histories about our people in recording those wampum bells, the way the wampum is set up and the line in the bells. Or in the Algonquin language family, they have birch bark scrolls. And those birch bark scrolls also require the expertise of an oral historian who can read that and understand it and then recite that to the people. Now there are times in the year, again, when those keepers of those oral histories share their stories. And they share their stories usually in a big group with people who want to learn about their histories. So those oral historians are very important. They serve a vital survival aspect of who we are, our identity. So it's really good when you meet up with oral historians, of which there are many walking around. And I know, Anita, you were just talking to us about Rick Hill, who works at the Smithsonian and who can read the wampum bells. And he came into Western University and he recited a number of the wampum bells. He's an oral historian. He's a good example of what an oral historian is. The third type of storytelling is the orators. And you've all heard orators. Those are the people who are gifted in being able to speak and to share and to express themselves in such a beautiful way, in such a good delivery, that everyone listens. And we have a lot of orators. A lot of our politicians are orators. They have that gift of being able to communicate and communicate to the people. And they reach a lot of people with the stories that they're sharing to bring people together, to unite them, to unite them so that you displace the colonial mentality. That's the idea of our orators, so that we get rid of that and the colonization of our minds. So that's very important. And then the last type of storytelling is the type that Mary Lou and I do, where we go out and we actively engage to find the stories in communities wherever their story is breaking, and we go and we contact people in that community and we ask the questions that need to be asked: who, what, when, where, why, how, to get the story. And you have to be very particular about who you ask for that information. Normally, the way we do it is we go in with our tobacco, we go in with our digital recorder, and we always offer the tobacco because we want to do things in a good way. We don't want to, we tell them that we're going to use whatever information they provide us in a good way. We're not going to misrepresent it at all. It's very important that when we're using tobacco, one of our sacred medicines, that medicine, that medicine is the leaf of the Creator. And that medicine, when you ask for help, you expect them to share with you the truth. And then when you give medicine, you give that Yambaloni to them at the end of the interview, then you thank them. You thank them from your heart for sharing what they did to you. So we often travel and we go out and seek those public and current affairs of Turtle Island. Before, we used to do a lot of it on the phone. You used to get really long distance phone calls, but now you can do it on the internet. You can do it social media, social networking. You can do it on Skype. You can talk to people on Skype. It's just amazing. A couple weeks ago, in 1 week, we had a breaking CBC series called The Fire, hosted by Wobbs Canoe. We had the premiere of this APTN series called Blackstone, their second year of their series that has a who's who of our actors, our best actors are in that series. So Thursday, Don Kelly was featured. He's the communications officer with the AFN, who also has a program on APTN called Fish Out of Water. It's a comedy series. It's fun. I always get a kick out of him learning about other nations' practices, protocols, and how he tries to fit in. But he's definitely a fish out of water, and he does it with great humor. And there's a lot of permissible disrespect in that series, but he's welcomed into those communities. But he had a show called Trailbreakers, which was on a Saturday or a Thursday afternoon, 1 o'clock, CBC, and he profiled a number of Aboriginal, Indigenous people who are making a difference. So that was happening, and then the following week, CBC launched a television series with Adam Beach called Arctic Air. 20 years ago, there was just an absence of any kind of positive representation of our culture and our identity on TV, or radio, or print. It was all sensationalistic, misrepresentative, because, as Mary Lou said, the reporters were non-native. There were certain programs, like Mary Lou was talking about, the program in journalism for Native people, which ran at the University of Western Ontario from 1980 to 1990, did graduate a number of communicators, journalists, I should say. There's a difference between journalists and communicators. Journalists are the ones who can tell the story, take the story, get the facts, write the story, transmit the story, however, but they know all the technology. They know how to take a picture. They know how to use a video recorder. Mary Lou and I, we don't know how to do all that. So we're pretty much, we're storytellers, but we're public affairs, current affairs storytellers, but we're not, we wouldn't call ourselves journalists. Even though we've been doing a lot of journalistic work, we wouldn't call ourselves journalists, because there's no way I know how to run a video camera, or even a digital camera. I have a hard time with that. So those people who graduated from that program found that there was no budget in the newsrooms of mainstream media across Canada. None. So none of them, when they came out of the PJNP program with their diploma, could find work. There was contract work, of course, where they would work for 6 months or a year, and that was it. Then they would have to go back and start looking for work again. But there was no place, no budget to hire a native person who could help sensitize, culturally sensitize, or provide some kind of cultural competency for the newsrooms across Canada. So the work, what came out when it came to covering a story on Indigenous issues were very misrepresentational, and to me, I found it to be, there was a lot of media bias, and I found it to be a media propaganda that we read a lot of. And that propaganda needs to be combated, and it's good, it's best when we do it. So when we had the opportunity in 1990 to start to share our commentary, share our opinions to the public at large, we found that was a form of, I wrote the word up here, boiling, because we started to share, from our perspective, the historical context of most of the stories that were happening. Because most of the stories that happen today are a result of a couple hundred years ago, incidents that were being played out, that most reporters don't have a clue about, or have never been academically inclined or taught in their journalism schools or in their public education curriculum, really, right? And they never had that, so that they never get to do their homework on the history. And as a result of that, their stories that they write are very misrepresentational, and due to the editorial deadlines, the editor usually can edit the story down so much that what the final product is not very, it's not a very good story, or it's not a very good representation of the facts. So we find ourselves searching for Dubwebin. Dubwebin is an Ojibwe word for one of the grandfather teachings called truth. Okay, now truth, Dubwebin is it's a very interesting gift, because the kind of truth telling that we do, there has to be healing that will result from it. And so that when we do our commentaries, when we do our public education segments on smoke signals at that website, those TV websites over there, we try to educate the public. And we want to be like the cultural bridgers. And we want to bridge their culture and our culture. And we want to do it in a good way so that they learn. My friend Anita, she says that we're very calming. She says that we say everything in a way that we're not trying to provoke, to be provocative, in your face, or anything like that. We're just putting the facts on the table, and oftentimes when we do that, people can believe it or not. It's their choice. And we try to put it in a way that conveys our perspective of our culture, our identity in a good way. And if it promotes healing, if it promotes greater understanding, then we have to boil it. So that's our ultimate goal, is to achieve Dubwebin. When Dennis Banks came to the Onondaga Longhouse, right after that, there was a group from Akwesasne that was there. They came down on the bus, and the Nation House at Akwesasne had a newspaper called Akwesasne Notes. It was an award-winning publication that was published 4 times a year, every season. And what was unique about this paper was that the stories that were in the paper were written by news people or communicators in the communities. Not by reporters sitting in a newsroom in Toronto or Ottawa, but written by people who were in the communities and who were Indigenous. So, to me, when I was asked if I wanted to go and spend some time in the Nation House, spend some time with the Mohawk brothers and sisters, keepers of the Eastern Door. I was asked that. My sister was asked that. My brother, who had already spent some time there, said it would be a great experience if you did this. So he convinced me to go on this odyssey and this journey to Akwesasne, where the partridge grows. So I went there, and I met the editor, a man by the name of Lally Hopewatts, who was a white man, an academic. He had a PhD in mathematics, but he had the heart of an Indigenous person. And he was adopted into the Mohawk Nation by people like Ernie Benedict and Ira Benedict, Clarence Moses David, Clarence White, Tommy Porter, Linguist, Tommy Cook, the Boots. And so he ran this newspaper called Akwesasne Notes. He was the editor. And he would spend an inordinate amount of time gathering stories. And the stories that he gathered were about our culture, our identity, from the mouths of our people in those communities where a story was happening. And then you would take that and you would put it in the paper. You would lay it out, spend days laying it out. Remember back in those days, they didn't have fax machines. They didn't have ways of transmitting knowledge, transmitting stories, transmitting facts, historical data. You had to do it by snail mail. So that's why the paper only came out 4 times a year. So I got to do some apprenticeship working on the Akwesasne notes. I got to work on 2 issues. At one point I wasn't a layout editor or anything, but I got to work on the layout, but I got to read all the stories that were coming in. And what I really appreciated was those stories were written by our people, and they were written from our perspective to educate everybody. They weren't slanted towards Native people. They gave the Native side of the story, which I didn't find anywhere in the mainstream media, nowhere. And they were the only paper that did that. So when I had that experience, I knew that there was something about it. I was still, I didn't know what my gift was. We all have a gift. Each one of us has been given and blessed with some purpose that makes sense to us, that gives us great happiness, great peace, great joy when we do it. And we don't, some of us don't know what that gift is until many years later in life. In the old days, we knew what that gift was by the time we were 21, because we would go through the rites of passage that would be put up on the hill for men. The women would be put through their strawberry fast, and you would go through those rites of passage, and you would have that time to spend to find out what was it about your life that you wanted to dedicate yourself to. Now, when I went to Princeton, I wanted to help my people, and I wanted to get an education. I couldn't do both. I just found that I couldn't do both, and they were mutually exclusive. So I've since determined it was because I did not have a good sense of who I was. Now, I grew up on the Six Nations Reserve. My mother and father, we traveled around New York State, as my father was an iron worker. We returned back to the Six Nations in 1960. She became the caretaker of the Pauline Johnson homestead, known as Chiefswood. So I got to get briefed on the life of Pauline Johnson, one of our most famous orators, performance artists, writers, poets, recitalists. I mean, she did everything. And she was just like a firebrand. And she did it all. And she was a forerunner of the kind of activism that I see that Mary, you're talking about the suffragettes. They came to the Seneca people to learn about feminism, to learn about how to be women and how to assert themselves so that they could restore themselves back to some kind of gender equity, which in our communities we had gender equity. And so Pauline Johnson, I got to find out about her life and spend some time in her home, reading some of her writing. And what I found was that our culture was a beautiful culture, a beautiful way of life, just an exponentially attractive way to look at the world. And I just thought, you know, how could this be somehow miscommunicated? How could our non-Native brothers and sisters miss that? And you know, the answer has come back many times that they weren't listening. And so that's why whenever we do our workshops, we always use our medicines. We use the sage medicine because the sage medicine is a medicine for communication. It helps us to listen, it helps us to speak, but the sage reminds us that the Creator blessed each of us with 2 ears, 1 mouth, so that we would listen twice as much as we speak. And we have all learned a behavior where we speak twice as much as we listen. That's the kind of, we're very contrarian in that way. And somehow we learn this kind of behavior, and then we have to adjust it. I know I did. And I had to learn how to listen. And I had to listen to learn. And when I did that, then I found myself being very receptive to the oral tradition. It was almost like a blood memory began to kick in, telling me, spend some time, don't say anything, just listen. If there's silence, listen to it. What do you hear from within yourself? And I started to do that. And I started finding that there was a real beautiful unfolding of how our people used to be. And for me, it was really quite a tearful experience, because all of a sudden they're experiencing this with many of our elders who just who put me in a good place, who honored me by sharing with me their stories, their oral narratives, their oral histories. And I found myself just wanting to take it in all in, wanting more and more and more. But I knew that I knew that when they were tired, to leave them be and let them get some rest, and we'll do it again next time we meet. So Mary Lou and I have been very fortunate in that regard. When we first began our radio career, we got together with a number of storytellers, and we formed this group called, what was it called? Do you remember what it was called, Jean?
Native News Network.
That was afterwards.
Oh.
We had the Storytellers Club or something like that. We formed it at the Namarine Friendship Center. There was some kind of story club, storytellers or something. Anyways, there was a number of us Native people who wanted to share our stories with each other and share how to tell our stories in a good way. And there was a number of us who came together, and that's where we met Jeremy Price, who came from this radio station CHRW at the University of Western Ontario. He heard about us. The London Free Press heard about us, and they came and sat down with us. And then we decided from there, from that incubation, we were going to form the Native News Network, because we saw a real need, especially, as Mayor Lou described, Oka, Kanesatake. As that story was breaking, no one was getting the story. Not one journalist asked the Mohawk and Nambihaga people why they were in the Pines, why they were making a stand there, of all places. But if they had, they would have got the same answer that many of you remember Ippawash, Ojodana, in a place called Stony Point, on a land called Camp Ippawash, next to Ippawash Provincial Park. September 6th was September 5th. Well, in 1993, the Stony Point people got tired of waiting to have their land returned to them. And they went back out to the land to reclaim it, while the Department of National Defense was still there, present. So they lived side by side, kind of adversarially for a while, but they began to find ways of respecting each other and not bothering each other, staying out of each other's hair. And what was unique about that was on September 5th, the Stony Point people began to make a move into Ippawash Provincial Park from Camp Ippawash. And they weren't armed, despite all the media releases by the OPP and by the Harris government. None of them were armed, because they knew that it goes against our way to pick up guns, because that's not the warrior teaching. The warrior teaching is that we're to use our good minds to make good decisions, to find alternative ways to resolving conflict and confrontation without using weapons. That's the warrior way. We're all blessed. Warriors are blessed with that good mind to be able to find that alternative dispute resolution mechanism within them, to find ways of avoiding conflict and confrontation with weaponry. In fact, at Stony Point, they had a ceremony called burying the hatchet. Now, you've all heard that term, bury the hatchet. Well, that term comes from the great law of peace. Because when the peacemaker came and brought this great peace constitution to the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and then the Onondaga people, he said that you are now going to abandon your hatchets, and you will bury it underneath the tree of peace, which is a white pine, which is the symbol of our Constitution. And so all of your weapons of war will now be buried underneath this tree of peace, and you will now walk in peace. You will walk in peace amongst all people. You will walk in unity, the power of the people, power of unity. He did a demonstration. You've all probably heard about the demonstration of the 5 arrows. Once, it's pretty easy to break one arrow. He broke it. And he says it's a little harder, but you can still break these 2 arrows. He did the second set of arrows. The 3rd set, he had a little harder time, but eventually he was able to break it. The 4th wouldn't break, but finally he was able to angle it and break them. But the 5th, when there were 5 arrows together, he couldn't break them. So that tells us the teaching on the power of unity. If we bring our minds and hearts together and we unite, we can do anything. So with regard to the tree of peace, it was buried beneath the weapons of war was buried underneath the tree of peace, where a river flowed, subterranean water, and carried the weapons of war away. And then the tree of peace was planted on top. And from that tree of peace, 4 white leaves extended to the 4 directions. Anyone who wanted to live according to this Constitution of peace, power, and righteousness could follow those roots back to the source, back to the land of the tree of peace, and could live according to those laws, and live according to that. And it's very compatible with the 7 grandfathers. It's very compatible with all the other constitutions of North America, because we believe that the peacemaker, when he left our people, he headed off to the west. He said that I will come back, and I will come back from the east. So we believe he headed off to the west, to all the other language families, to all the other nations, to bring a message of peace. And so when he left, we hear stories from some of the old storytellers about their having a peacemaker too. Visit them, bringing great peace. But a lot of that has been displaced, a lot of those stories. But from time to time, we find people who have researched it and found out that they did have, in fact, a great peace as well. And I always like to say that because in our classes, we teach 2 courses at the University of Western Ontario. We teach a course on Indigenous spirituality, which we've been teaching for about 4 years. And we've been teaching this media course at the University of Western Ontario on representation since 2006. But a lot of people ask us about the Christianizing, the missionizing that took place. And we always like to remind them that Jesus Christ did not walk on this land. Buddha did not walk on this land. Mohammed did not walk on this land. But we had our own prophets. We had the peacekeeper. We had this form of the peacekeeper that traveled to all of our other nations. They were our prophets. So we have prophets here who taught us a great way to live. And it's still in time. And it's contained in the 13 language families that exist in Turtle Island. And just to give you an idea of how diverse, because language comes from the land, and the diversity of this land is reflected in the 13 language families. In Africa, they have 7 language families. For all of Africa, there's only 7 language families. In all of Europe, there's 5 language families. So when we have 13 in North America, that gives you an idea of how diverse our people are in our ways of, like Mary Lou, who said we're mixed marriage. The Algonquin language family is quite distinct from the Haudenosaunee Iroquois language. Quite different. We do a lot of things different. As Joe Couture, Dr. Joe Couture once taught us, he says, on the surface features are going to be different, but on a deeper level, on a higher level, consciousness of being, they're the same. So we respect that. We are all the same on a deeper, higher level, but on the surface, we do have differences. So, and I believe that our storytellers help bridge those differences. That's the flavor that our storytellers possess. And you probably had the good fortune here, especially at Trent University, of hearing from a lot of storytellers. I'm thinking of one of our sisters, Lee Miracle, that we always are very grateful to come into contact with, because she's a keeper of stories, and she speaks a good way of it. But so at Stony Point, they had this bury the hatchet ceremony, so they all knew that they couldn't carry guns into Ipperwash Provincial Park. Yet the story was covered in the Post, the Toronto Sun, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, London Free Press, and not one journalist asked the Stony Pointers why they were in the park that night. All they wrote was the press releases, media releases that came from the OPP and came from the Harris government. Now, I believe Jean actually tried to talk to the OPP, Jean Koning, our friend back here. She actually talked to the OPP who maintained that steadfast, they were returning fire, that lie, that misrepresentation of the facts, because there was no returning fire. But there were 7 rifles, 7 guns that were discharged that night. One of them resulting in the death. The Amnesty International called it the extrajudicial execution of W. George. And we knew W. W was a peaceful man. He was a very lovable brother. He wouldn't hurt a flea. He loved to laugh. He loved the joy of life. And everyone took care of W. Everyone had a role in being Dudley's friend. And he didn't have an enemy in the world. And yet the police targeted him and shot him, of all the people that were in the park that night. But if they had asked the Stony Pointers shortly after the story broke, why they were in the park that night, they would have found out the same answer that the Mohawk and Yangahaga people gave after they were fired upon by the SQ. And the answer was that they were protecting their ancestors. There were burial sites in the Pines, in Gansatage, and there were burial sites in Ipperwash Provincial Park. And all Harris had to do was his right-hand person was this chief of staff by the name of Deborah Hutton. Deborah Hutton went to the University of Western Ontario. She graduated. There they have a Department of Anthropology and Archaeology, which is where our office is at the University of Western Ontario, and the Department of Anthropology Native Language Center. And she could have just called them up and asked them, are there burial sites in Ipperwash Provincial Park? And the answer would have been yes, there are. There's about 3 that we know of, that the archaeologists of the University of Western Ontario knew about. 3 burial sites. So that's what the Stony Point people, defendants, were doing. And under the color of right, there were 22 of them charged, and under the legal principle of the color of right, they believed that they were protecting their ancestors, and the judge believed them, and he acquitted them and dropped all the charges. So when we talk about representation, the media coverage of Ipperwash is so bad. We have the media analysis that was written by Professor John Miller, Chair of Journalism at the University of Ryerson University in Toronto. he was commissioned by the Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto to write a news media coverage analysis of Ipperwash for ALST, for the Ipperwash Inquiry. And he wrote it. It's a 74-page document where he details how the people, the reporters, the journalists who covered that story were just wrong. And they were writing misrepresentation of the facts because no one asked until many weeks later, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, why they were in the park. It was a very sad day, as he concludes his report. It was a sad day for journalism. So that's why Mary Lou and I, we're sharing our course on how to cover Indigenous issues in the mainstream media, in the alternative media, because we believe, as a result of a lot of the media coverage, a lot of our major stories, that there has been a lot of misrepresentation, propaganda, and media bias. Those are the three big. We want to dispel that, and we teach our students how to get the story. We teach our students how to. When you go into a community, because of our storytelling nature, and you go in and you want to get a story, and you want to ask who, what, when, where, why, how, don't expect a linear answer, one sentence, linear answer. Go in there and expect a nice, long, circuitous story that has the answer in it. And if you do that, and you've got the time to do it that way, you are going to get the story plus some history. And you're going to be given the historical context of the story. That's the beauty of our way. But journalism schools haven't figured that out. And so that's why we're doing it. Because one of my brothers, does anyone here know Rodney Babawash, who died a few years back? Lynn, you knew Rodney? Well, Rodney was an academic that lived in Toronto for several years. He was the executive director of the Native Nature Center. He did a lot of good work in the community. But he used to tell us that every day he reads the Toronto Sun. And I said to him, the Toronto Sun? Why would you read the Toronto Sun? He says, because I want to know what the enemy is writing about us. And it's important to know what they're saying. And I saw the wisdom of what he was saying, and I says, right, because they're not doing it right. It's important to know how we can correct that. So we have our students, we look at stories that are written, that are breaking stories, and we have our students look at the Toronto Star coverage, the Globe and Mail coverage, the National Post coverage, London Free Press coverage, and the Toronto Sun coverage. So we tell them, this is what you don't, this is how you do not cover the story the way the Toronto Sun does. So has anyone ever heard, has anyone here seen Sun TV? Sun TV, it's a new right-wing. Okay, well that television station, I don't know, they have this one guy who gets up every now and then, Ezra Levant. It would be good to debate him sometime. I would love the opportunity. But he purports to be a reporter, journalist. He has written, but he's very right-wing. And he did a story on Attawapiskat recently. And he talked about the funding, the $90 million of funding that's gone into Attawapiskat over the past few years. And he painted such an unrealistic, misrepresentational, propagandized version of the Attawapiskat story. I just could not believe it. I couldn't believe it. There's another newscaster out there, commentator by the name of Charles Adler. Fortunately, our good friend, who's no longer with us, Dr. Patricia Montour, she debated him on APTN on how he gets his stories, how he gets his facts, why he frames his facts and his stories the way he does. And he's doing it for effect. And Patricia couldn't understand why he just doesn't present them. Let the viewer, let the reader, let the listener decide. You know, they don't need to try to tell us how to think, how to indoctrinate us to think, see, and listen the way they want us to listen. But that's what they do. And that's why I say it's very much a tool of propaganda. But the Awapiskat story, as most of you have been watching, has always been framed in like a morality tale. There's the good guys and there's the bad guys. Oftentimes the Indians are the bad guys. Same as the cowboy and western formula, Indians are the bad guys. And I remember myself growing up as a little boy rooting for the cowboys. I remember that because I was bombarded with this idea that the Indians were the bad guys from the cowboy and western movies. So I started to embark on a journey of self-discovery about who our people were. I couldn't see my grandmother and grandfather, who were both, my grandmother was a clan mother, my grandfather was a hereditary chief. I couldn't see them as being savage or pagan, as they were depicted in the history books, in the educational curriculum. I couldn't see that. But yet that's how they were depicted, because they had traditional beliefs. And I'm thinking, how, that just doesn't make sense. But somehow I became indoctrinated into that way of thinking. And I had a sense of low self-worth, low self-esteem, and I had shame. And I felt really sorry about that for many years afterwards because I didn't know how to deal with it. And it wasn't until I had the good fortune of running into people like Jake Thomas, Joe Couture, Floyd Hand, Art Solomon, the people that we met in Toronto, Vern Harper, you know, that they all began to show me a different way of looking at our people, a true way. And then I started seeking out the true history, the true knowledge of our people. And when I found that, and I started discovering that, I had to share it. Unfortunately, Mary Lou and I, we had this opportunity to do it in radio. And then Mary Lou, because many of our ceremonials, sometimes we have rigid protocols, shall we say? I'll say that very lightly. But we have practitioners who do things in a very rigid way, and we witness our own people getting yelled at by our ceremonial leaders. And so Mary Lou said, well, I'm going to do something about this because that's not right. I don't like it. So she started writing about protocol, and she started writing about our ceremonies in a way that everyone could understand how to conduct themselves around a ceremony, which is very sacred. And we shouldn't be yelling at our people because they do something that they never been taught. So that became, for Mary Lou, it became really good because everyone started reading her columns. In the Anishinaabe News, Ojibwe Akin, News from Indian Country Today, yeah, and you said the Messenger from Ottawa. Yeah. So that's when we began to embark on telling the story straight, telling the story from our perspective. And then when we got the opportunity to work in television, we started to reach more people. And oftentimes, I like to tell people about this. In our communities, we have a chief and council. And usually the chief and council under the Indian Act are answerable to Indian affairs, not answerable to the communities. So as a result, there's no opposition to chief and council. Oftentimes, the only opposition that there is in our communities are storytellers, are journalists, are communicators who write and try to tell the truth from their perspective the best that they can. And sometimes that's contrary to what the chief and council want, and they may get ostracized. There may be all kinds of things can happen to a storyteller. To a storyteller. So when you become a storyteller, I always advise people to start developing a skin 7 spans thick, because you have to become thick-skinned, because you will be criticized, you will be held up sometimes in public contempt, you will be rejected, and oftentimes you become a target. And when you become a target by your own people, you have to, you know, and I love our people. And, you know, I love brown-skinned people. And when they use me as a target, I'm glad that they're using me. Because Jake Thomas taught me, under the great law, we have to, our chiefs, our clan mothers, our faith keepers, our pine tree chiefs have to develop a thick skin, 7 spans thick, because they will become targets. And I found that, like we look after the Eagle staff, we look after some sacred items. When we began doing that, we became targets. Because we weren't carrying the Eagle staff right, or we weren't looking after our eagle feathers right. See, there's a lot of that out there, but I usually just let it fall off my shoulders, and I just kind of disregard it. But when I try to teach people what I've learned, what happened to me, I try to do it in the best way possible on how I did it, on how I do things. And I try to do it as respectfully as possible. Fortunately, we have had the good benefit of being taught by some good people, and we're able to pass that on so that their wisdom is still alive. Their teachings are still alive. You know, I like to think of Art Solomon, Jake Thomas, Jimmy Sky, Harvey Longboat, Joe Couture. You know, their teachings are all through this place, Trent University. You know, because they taught us, young people, and we had the forbearance to sit down with them and listen to them and absorb it, so that one day it's our turn, it becomes our turn. It's like this circle. It's our turn to pass it on to the young people, because they're looking too. They're searching the same way that I was. So it becomes my responsibility to pass it on to them the same way it was passed on to me. Fortunately, it's a lot more instantaneous today because of the new media that we have out there. I mean, I can go on YouTube, and I can listen to one of the best speakers I used to always listen to was Philip Deere. He was the spiritual leader of the American Indian movement, and I can go on YouTube, type in Philip Deere, and bang, there it is. You know, that's how fast it is now. Tommy Porter, great specialist in group dynamics. You know, the way he can move an audience. You know, so we have that, but now it's all available on your computer. I think people have cell phones that you can do that on too, smartphones. So times are really changing. And I hope that we can, I remember when the internet was big, about 1990, one of our senior journalists, I can't remember his name right offhand, but I remember him saying that we have to get on to the information superhighway. Otherwise, we're going to be roadkill. You know? So we have to learn. We have to adapt. And that's one thing we're good at. We're good at adapting as a people. So I'm just going to pass over to her.
We brought some newspapers from the University of Western Ontario. Maybe we could just pass them along. Inside, on page 5, there's a story of one of our guest speakers, Peter Edwards. He was at Ipperwash when Dudley got shot. And the only reason why they were able to get Dudley out of the park onto a hospital was because they put Peter in front of the native people, because they knew that they wouldn't shoot a white man. So he started writing for the Toronto Star about what was going on, and he was writing very truthfully. And then he wrote a book about One Dead Indian, and it was made into a movie. So this is a story that was taking place in our class a couple weeks ago.
Another interesting aside is that he's on the crime beat for the Toronto Star. He writes about the Hells Angels. He wrote about the Bandidos trial in London last year. He writes about, he's a specialist in crime. He said that it was harder to cover the Ipperwash story. It was harder to cover that story because of all the secrecy by the OPP and by the Harris government than it was to write about the Hells Angels. He said it was so hard to write that story, and he persevered, and he was determined to write that story, and he did. He got it right.
So does anybody have any questions?
Yes. Oh, okay. Well, any other questions? Well, thank you. Jimmy Gretsch, Nella, for being a great audience. See you tomorrow.
Hey Joe, hello.
Yes.
I want to give you something, thanks for all that information and our positions you give us suggestions with your run. I'm Michael Stanley, I'm the author of Children of Fear.
Oh, okay.
And I put here to Joe and Mary Lou and me at Warsdale. I'm a co Warsdale. And I signed it this year.
Oh, okay. Thank you, brother. Very good.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the next workshop is coming in, so I guess we have to,
You know,
yeah.